this plaque, which has arrived. You do have it. Unfortunately, we weren't able to celebrate last year, so we are very excited to celebrate in your honor this year. And so the plaque reads, presented in honor of outstanding contributions to the study of cognitive processes in animals, Dr. Irene Pepperberg. And I'll now turn things over to Debbie Kelly to host this special session.
Okay, let's just make sure. There we go. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ken. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the Comparative Cognition Society's Research Award recipient, Dr. Irene Pepperberg. This is an award, as Ken mentioned, bestowed upon an individual who's been selected by their scientific peers to have made an outstanding contribution to the study of comparative cognition in animals. One component of these events is a symposium consisting of invited speakers, each providing a 15-minute talk on a research project or a program of research inspired or influenced by Irene's work. These talks are available to view at your convenience through links available on the CO3 online conference program. Additionally, the March 2021 issue of Learning and Behavior has been dedicated in honor of Irene. And this special issue is open access until May 31st, 2021, thanks to John Crystal. The main event, of which we are all here for, is the master lecture by Irene. But before I introduce her, I just want to remind everybody that immediately following Irene's master lecture, we'll have a 15-minute question and answer period with Irene and the symposium speakers right here just following. Also, please join us in the social event honoring Irene, which will start at 1:15 and will be hosted by Suzanne Gray. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Irene Pepperberg. Really, this incredible researcher needs no introduction whatsoever. Irene Pepperberg is famously known not only in scientific circles, but throughout the general public worldwide for her research into cognitive and communicative abilities of animals, and most notably her studies with language-trained gray parrots. Research that started with an ordinary gray parrot named Alex, purchased from a pet store, and continuing on with Griffin and Athena. But Irene didn't venture into comparative cognition through their traditional routes. She completed a master's in chemistry and a PhD in chemical physics, both from Harvard University. Her move into comparative cognition more formally began with a postdoctoral fellow in animal-human communication at Purdue University, where she subsequently accepted a position as a research associate in the Department of Biology. Next, she moved to Northwestern University as a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology, and then to the University of Arizona as an associate professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, with a joint appointment in psychology. Subsequently, Irene has held many positions, such as the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Media Lab, Brandeis University, and most recently, she's returned to Harvard University. Irene's scientific dedication to investigating cognition and communication has helped forge a path for our understanding of the cognitive abilities of animals, particularly with respect to symbolic representation, numerical competence, and inferential reasoning. She has published over 150 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and commentaries, and she is a fellow of many prestigious scientific societies, such as APA, AAAS, Psychonomic Society. Irene has given countless research presentations, and I do mean countless because I stopped counting after page 10 of just the invited presentations. Irene has also communicated the importance of comparative cognition research globally to the general public through her books Alex and Me, which was a New York Times bestseller, and the Alex Studies, as well as through countless seminars, workshops, and public events. Irene has had and continues to have an impressive and influential career. Indeed, I was only able to scratch the surface in relaying her many accomplishments. But if being a brilliant researcher, scholar, and international comparative cognition superstar wasn't enough, Irene is well known for her strong commitment and dedication to supporting students and colleagues, be it in the lab, over dinner at a conference, or as of recent, through a Zoom window with a parrot perched inquisitively on her shoulder. With this, I would like to introduce our CCS Research Award recipient, Dr. Irene Pepperberg. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Just take me a minute to get my slides here. Okay, come on, let's go slides. Share, okay, and slideshow from the beginning. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Debbie. That is beautiful. And let's see, I have to kind of figure out how to, well, I see how to do this. All right. There must be a way that I can do this so I can read my screen without having the people there. Somewhere to get the gallery off is what I'm trying to do. Anybody know how to show? Okay, no, I don't want that. I want hide. Okay, all right, that will work. Okay, so let me start with my title, and pretty obvious. So sincere thanks to everybody involved. I could spend the entire talk just thanking people over all these years. A special call out to Suzanne Gray, who's been the last 8 years with me in the lab and helping in all sorts of amazing ways. But really, there have been amazing students all over. So thank you all so much. So I'm going to give an interesting, I think, talk. It is not going to be a kind of, replication crisis or anything like that, but it is going to be something to make us think more deeply about our work. And it started when I came across this lovely quote. It's an ancient quote. It is impossible for anyone to begin to learn that which one thinks one already knows, okay? And that's really important because we can't understand science unless we really dig down into the weeds. And I'm going to be saying that a lot today. Another appropriate quote is Alexandra Pope: "A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Pierian spring. Their shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again. However, very few know the next stanza. While from the bounded level of our mind, short views we take, nor see the lengths behind, but more advanced behold with strange surprise, new distant scenes of endless science arise," okay? And so that's what I'm going to try and get people to think about, okay? That all these cautions apply to several research areas. The idea is that by looking at them superficially, we learn something, but not enough. Animal language studies, not too many of you are old enough to have gone through that, the horrible mess in the 1980s with that. But the point was, people had animals absolutely doing some kind of two-way symbolic communication, but it wasn't language. And their claims that it was language ended up basically destroying the field. Concepts of same, different. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but there's an entire issue of current opinions on February talking about all the details and all the weeds one would get into when you're really trying to look at what same, different truly means. Probability studies, again, if you look at basic probability studies, there are so many things that are talking about, well, more is more likely. But if you understand probability, you know it's much more complicated than that. And you look at the kinds of things that even Piaget was doing, and you realize that it's a much more deep and incredible area. Optical illusions. We look at optical illusions generally on a two-dimensional plane, but only when we started looking at them in a three-dimensional understanding did we get to figure out what we were seeing and what our non-human compatriots were seeing. Numerical concepts and inference by exclusion, well, those are the two topics that I'm going to deal with mostly today. Not that they're the most recent things that we've done, but they're really a good description of how one can do some really great work and then find that there's a lot more to be done for it to really be great work. Okay, so let's start. So numerical competence is not simply the ability to label a set of objects with a specific tag, okay? It involves a number of very different abilities, and they're all required to claim full understanding. And that was not initially appreciated. So I'm going to start with a little numerical history, which is important. Otto Köhler, he was a researcher in Germany, in Freiburg, from the 1940s up till, he was working until the 80s, basically. And he was doing some amazing numerical work on corvids and parrots and some other birds as well. It was beautiful work. What he did was he had the birds look at a sample. I'm assuming you can see where I'm moving my little cursor here. He had the birds looking at some samples, and then they had to peck the one that corresponded to the correct numerical set. Well, you look at this and you realize he controlled for mass, he controlled for density, he controlled for contour, all the incredibly important things to make sure the animals were doing it with respect to number. He had an even more complicated study where the birds had more of these types of different types of boxes. Each box had a piece of paper with a set of blobs on it. Then he changed the blobs, their positions, their sizes, everything on each trial. And each number was different too. So the bird had to look at some set of blobs and then go to the right one, open that box, and that one had the correct number, had a little treat on it for it. And it turns out these birds were really quite accurate. Great parrots and corvids were accurate up to about 8. Chickens bottomed out at 2 or 3, although we know now from work of Giorgio Valterguerra that they can actually go to about 4 or so. Pigeons came in at about 4 or 5, which doesn't sound so exciting, except it turns out people at the same time that he was doing this work with birds were doing some very interesting work with humans. And it turns out if you flash sets of objects at humans, the way I'm going to do now, very quickly and ask how many, humans are only good up to accurately good, only up to about 4 or 5 themselves. Now, usually there's somebody in the audience who is a biologist who studies geese flying overhead, and they're really accurate up to about 8 or so because that's what they really have to do. But the average human is only good up to about 4 or 5 if you don't give them enough time to count. What kicks in is the approximate number system, and that's only good to about 4 or so. So there was considerable other related work going on at the same time, mostly in Köhler's lab with Lergler and Brohn, where they looked at simultaneous, and they worked at flashes of light, and then they went to a different modality and notes on a flute, and they changed the length of the flashes and the time intervals and all those kinds of things. And again, the parrots and the corvids were good to about 8. Premack was also doing some work. Those of you who know his work with the plastic chips with his chimpanzee Sarah, giving her Arabic numerals and the corresponding sets of objects. He was much better at doing match to sampling versus actual labeling of sets. And Geschwin, looking at humans, found that different parts of the human brain were involved in match to sample versus actual labeling of sets. So I was reading all this stuff, and at the time, I had a parrot that could vocally label a bunch of different objects, colors, shapes, and the shapes were particularly interesting because he knew that a triangle was 3-corner and a square was 4-corner. So this made me think, okay, we weren't necessarily sure he was counting corners, but he was recognizing different shapes, different sets. Could he maybe learn labels for sets of objects? So we started training him. We trained him first on 3 and 4, then on 5 and 2, and then on 6 and 1. And 1 was the last thing. And these are our data, not counting the data on 1 because we hadn't gotten to 1 yet. And so these are the objects we presented to Alex, sets of pieces of paper torn in random sizes, keys of different sizes and shapes, pieces of wood, wooden, tongue depressor sticks broken into bits and pieces and things. Pegwood was a clothespin, cork, bits and pieces of corks. And these were the labels used by the parrot. And you can see he's really, really accurate. Okay, none of this approximate number system. Unintelligible, okay, so we had blind testing, and sometimes he would say something like "3" instead of 3. It was kind of, and you couldn't tell if it was green or 3, so that had to be counted as an unintelligible error. He had a lot of these errors, and what these were generic errors. So I showed him a set of objects, and I said, how many? And he said, key. Well, you know, okay, Alex, they're keys, but how many key? I had to count that as an object, as an error. Sometimes he called pegwoods wood, and sometimes he called woods pegwoods, but he made almost none of these errors in terms of approximate number system. And if you take out these kinds of errors, the generic errors, and the ones where he just messed up with wood and pegwood, he had huge accuracy. So he really understood these. You could show him objects on a tray in a random array, things that he couldn't label at the time, and he would tell you what they were. You could show him mixed sets. And it turns out if you give a young child who's just learning to count a set like this, and you say, how many cork, the child tells you the total number. Alex was able to tell you subsets of these objects. So you can ask him how many key, how many cork, or how many toy. We made it even more complicated based on some work of Trick and Pollution, where we showed him 2 different sets of objects of 2 different colors. So woods and wools of different colors. And of course, there's different sizes as well. And you'd ask him, you know, how many rows wool? So he has to, you know, look and find them, not just see a batch of things and tell you what's there, but find them in this set and tell you. And again, he was really accurate, quite accurate on these things. He loved to say 4. So that was a bit of an issue sometimes, but he was really correct. And it was unlikely to be, although there were some ANS type errors, there weren't too many of them. And if there were true ANS errors, he would have made more errors at the larger numbers, which were less accurate. And he wasn't. He was actually more accurate at the large numbers. And to be honest, by the time we got these data, he was pretty bored. So here's a video of him doing this task, and hopefully it will work. And one of the things that you need to know before I start the video is that when he sees a tray like this, he's usually asked one question, the tray goes away, different objects get put on, and different questions. We were filming for a some kind of, you know, I don't know, Nova or something was there, and they wanted to see, well, you know, maybe you just, every time you show him a tray, he says 4, and that's, you know, all he knows, and he really doesn't know the test. So they made me keep asking him the questions. And you see him getting really annoyed. He's shaking his head. He doesn't want to work because he was right. Why didn't the tray go away? And why is he asking more questions? He's only asked the question a second time if he was wrong. So let's hope that this works. And he has to ask for his reward.
Irene, I'm not sure there's sound. Or maybe I'm the only one who can't hear it.
No, there's no sound.
Oh.
And
Okay.
Irene, if you can move your screen, we could see you a little better.
Okay, let me go back to stop screen sharing and make sure my computer is doing this right.
And reset the screen on your face.
Block.
Okay.
How many green block?
Can you hear it now?
Good boy. How many green block? Yeah, how many green block? How many green block? Good boy. How many green block? Now, how many green block? Good boy. Good parrot. Okay.
So we had production, all right, which, you know, we thought that was great. He understood it. And if you had been reading a lot of the child literature, everybody would say that, well, if you've got production, you have comprehension because comprehension precedes production. It turns out not so fast, all right? Everybody started looking at this and thinking, well, maybe he doesn't really understand what these labels represent. And the reason for this was work done by Karen Fusion, Sally Boyson, and Karen Wynn, who actually were working with different, you know, Karen and Wynn, Fusen and Wynn, working with children, Sally with the apes. It turns out Karen did this beautiful study with children who could look at a set of objects and count 1, 2, 3, 4. There are 4 marbles. You gave them a big bowl of marbles and say, give me 4. They grabbed a big handful and gave it to you. They had no idea what the numbers actually meant. So we had to test comprehension. And so we did this. It was 10 years later, because there were several lab moves in the intervening years and several other studies that students needed the time with the birds. And so we took a while. This is one of our control trials because we wanted to test the difference of whether he could do it with objects that were all the same size versus objects that weren't, okay? And most of the time, the task objects were different size, so he couldn't do mass density, whatever. And the question here was what color 6 or things like that. So again, it wasn't just asking him, give me something, but look through this big mess of things and find the correct number and then tell me its color. So it's a complicated task. And he was really, really correct on this one, okay? Some of these, okay, and what these were, okay, there were many trials, it turns out even more so than that, where he basically would look at the tray. He hated this because it was all old objects and it was boring and he'd whack them to the floor. Or he would turn around and start preening and ignore me completely. Or, and these were the kinds of trials over here, what he would do is he'd look at the tray, and if you, the colors here, he'd look at the tray and I'd say, what color 6? And he'd go, yellow, orange, gray, all the colors that weren't on the tray, all right? Basically telling me I don't want to do this. But we got the data and you can see he's really, really correct. But what is this thing with none? So on one of these trials, okay, we showed him the tray and there were 3, 4, and 6 things on the tray. And I asked Alex, what color does it mean? He goes 5. And the student who's there for the blind testing says to me, what's going on? I said, I don't know, we'll ask him again. So we go through this twice more. I ask him, what color 3? He keeps saying 5. So I finally look at him and he's not throwing things on the floor. He's not giving me all the wrong colors. So I finally look at him and I go, okay, smarty, what color 5? And he looks me straight in the eye and he goes, none. Response where nothing was same and different or nothing. And he had transferred this to an absence of a set and manipulated me into asking me the question he wanted to answer. So when we kind of, picked ourselves off the floor, we decided we had to test this, and we tested him on several other sets, and he was right on 5 out of 6 trials, okay, of telling us none when there was an absent set. So we call this a zero-like concept because we really had no understanding. We hadn't trained up with, and so we had to look at it in more detail. We also had some weird evidence of him being able to add sequential sounds. So in an attempt to replicate some stuff with working with Griffin, and we were at Brandeis now, so the birds were in cages next to one another, and we were doing sequential sounds, and we worked on the sound intervals and the lengths of the sounds and stuff through computers, but basically the task was something like, listen, how many? And Griffin was supposed to tell me 2. Well, Griffin's little beak was out of joint that day, and I clicked and he had his back to me and started preening. And I'm going, Griffin, listen, how many? And Alex in the next cage goes, 4. And I'm going, Alex, be quiet. I didn't click 4 times. And so I go, Griffin, listen, how many? And Alex goes, 6, which is his neighbor for 6. And I'm going, uh-oh, he's adding the sounds. So given that doing that kind of task is really hard to control for, we decided to clearly replicate the work of Sally. We couldn't let the birds walk around the lab the way she was able to have her apes walk around her lab, but we did it this way. So we put things under cups, and again, this is very soft, so you might be able to hear. We showed you
Again.
Yep.
How many nuts delivered?
And
3.
So
That's
we
right.
eventually used 3 separate cups. We later put numerals under the cup. I'm going to talk about numerals in a minute. And he could do that too. He was completely correct on that. He was very, very accurate. Okay, again, really good accuracy. The issue though was right here, which was very interesting because these trials represented 5 plus 0. And every time he saw 5 plus 0 under our condition of just, 1 or 2 seconds, he would say 6. And I'm going, he knows 5. He's known 5 for 10 years. What is going on here? And then it occurred to me, okay, when you give humans a set of things and you don't give them time to count, they use the approximate number system. And here we had a big blob of stuff, and the biggest blob of stuff he knows is 6. So we were halfway through the trials, and he wasn't doing this with like 2 and 3. So halfway through the trials, we slowed down and we gave him many more seconds, and then he was right 100% of the time on 5 and 0. The none was very interesting because there we showed him there was nothing under any of the cups and asked him how many total. And he just, 5 times he seriously looked at us and went, shrugged his little birdie shoulders like, I don't understand what you're talking about. 3 times he said 1, which is interesting because it's at the low end of the number line. And also it sounds like, none and 1 sound alike. And Matsuzawa's chimpanzee eye, who had been trained on 0, would often mix up 1 and 0. Now remember, Alex was not trained on 0-like concept or 0 or anything. We were just testing to see what he understood at this point. And it was clear that he had some understanding of it representing to the attribute of a collection, okay, not an actual number. I'm actually asking him to comment on something that doesn't exist. So it seemed to be at the stage of very young children who have some but not full comprehension of the label. So the popular press was claiming that non-humans could count. But could they? Okay, could they really count? At this point, all we could really claim was that they had symbols that represented exact quantities, which is pretty good. But, wasn't isomorphic with actual human counting. They had a very good memory for visual representations. And the way people who were studying children studied, they were N knowers, where N was, large. It was up to, 6 for Alex and 8 for Matsuzawa's chimp. But was it the same? So we wanted to look at other aspects of numerosity, mainly ordinality. And to do ordinality, we had to train him on Arabic numerals, okay? Because if we just show him sets of things and what number bigger or smaller, that's not really the same as having him understand what the representations mean. Okay, so we trained to use a tray like this, and the questions were things like what color 6 or what number orange. And we trained him on this for all of his numbers without the presence of sets of objects. So what we were doing was training him to use the same label he used for actual sets for these little squiggles, okay? And at the beginning, all these were squiggles for him. We wanted to see if he could infer an equivalence connection, i.e. a label such as 6. He already had comprehension and reduction that they represented blobs of stuff. We trained him that it represented a particular squiggle, but could he understand that the squiggle represented a set without specific training? And we had to make the test both interesting and set it so that we could collect enough data without training him. So instead of asking him to just identify the number that was bigger, we asked him to identify the color of the bigger or smaller numeral. So again, it wasn't just bigger and it wasn't just smaller, but he could be asked either bigger or smaller on trays like this. And of course, we interchanged the orders and where they were. And the question was, what color bigger, what color smaller? And he was right quite often. Okay, when I say only color, what happened was sometimes when I asked him what color number bigger, he gave me the number itself, which was correct, but it wasn't what I asked him. So I cranked the data both ways. If you're being very specific about my answer, what I was asking him to respond to, it was about 75, but he was closer to 90, okay, if you counted just his, understanding of the numbers. Sometimes he said none. There was what we call an orange-yellow confound. Okay, parrots see in the ultraviolet. And we were using these little refrigerator letters that you use for kids, the magnetic back letters. And so for him, we had found in previous studies that what we would consider orange, he would sometimes consider yellow or rose, all right? And we never gave him a contrast between yellow and orange or orange and rose for that reason. So that if he said, you know, yellow when the answer was orange, there wasn't a yellow thing on the tray. So we could ask him a second time, but we counted it as an error. Sometimes he was wrong. Sometimes he said a color not on the tray, but he was basically got this down. We gave him size differences in the numerals. Okay, what color number, bigger, smaller? The first 5, he replied with the color of this something that was larger physically. Okay, but about halfway through, he flipped. Having all the other experiences with all the other numbers, he started to realize that we were asking what they meant and replied none. We couldn't present opposition because he died before we could do that study. He also responded appropriately to numeral and object set combinations. So if you gave him 6 squiggle versus 3 blobs, and you ask him what color number smaller, he'd say yellow. All right. Unless the Arabic number was pitted against a single object, okay, and then he consistently said none. So that kind of made sense too. So the data showed that he not only understood equivalence, but it inferred the ordinality of the numerals, which apes needed training, and he did not. So, however, you know, there were a lot of issues that still separated human and non-human abilities. And this was about the time that I moved to Harvard, first at the Radcliffe Institute and then the psych department, and was talking to people like Susan Carey and Liz Felke, who were looking at number concepts in children. And we talked a lot about this, and it turned out both humans and non-humans learn their first numbers very slowly and with difficulty. With children, they have to be about 2.5 years old before they become one knowers. So they understand one versus lots. It takes another 9 months for them to understand and become two knowers. So they know one versus two versus lots. Another 5 months to become three knowers, one versus two versus three versus lots, okay? But about the time they're learning 4, they've also learned by rote their number line. So if you ask a kid to count, just, you know, say, can you count from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7? They understand it about as well as they do the alphabet at that time, where they think LMNOP is one letter, okay? But about the time they learn 4, okay, and this is the number line, is something animals are generally not trained to do, the children integrate all the information, okay? They understand this, what's called the successor function, that 5 is 1 more than 4 and so forth, and they pretty much go up and get it, okay? They have some trouble when you get, you know, why is 12 not 2-teen or something like that, all right? And there's some recent evidence by Adrienne Schachner I got a preprint, that they still have trouble, like, you know, 23 and 24 understanding those really large numbers, but they're beginning to understand this idea. Apes so far have not, you know, gotten the success. They haven't been tested on the successor function. So the problem with Alex was, okay, we hadn't learned his numbers in order, okay? So what was going on there? I mean, again, remember he learned had to do 3 and 4 first, then 5 and 2, and then 6 and 1. And 1 was actually the hardest for him because he already said that thing was a key. Why did he now have to call it 1 key, all right? So anyway, but Alex, like the apes and the children, did learn a small number slowly. And like apes, but unlike children, he learned a large number slowly too. But he inferred the number line, which is something the apes didn't do. So it occurred to Susan and Liz and myself that maybe learning numbers for him was a vocal issue. Remember, he wasn't pointing at the numbers or pointing at the sets. He had to say those responses. And imagine saying 5 without lips and vote without lips. Not so easy. Okay. So what we did was we trained him on the Arabic 7 and 8, okay, without any objects other than those squiggles. So for him, they were just squiggles with these funny labels, okay. And we retrained 6 because he had called it 6. And because he was starting to say 7 as 1, we had to make sure that we weren't just waiting for another syllable for 7. So 6 had to be 2 syllables, 6, okay. And this took 13 months. 8 came almost immediately because he understood the label great, but that V and the 7 was really hard. And in fact, he ended up calling it 7, but that was clear enough. We then taught him that 6 was less than 7 was less than 8, 8 was less than 7 was less than 6, using the same way we had tested ordinality. So we trained him on this, but okay, he didn't see the whole number line on this. He had just seen 7, 8, the novel things with respect to 6. And we tested on that. He was pretty accurate on it, but there were a lot of errors again on orange. And on telling me, when I asked him what color number bigger, what color number smaller, he gave me the number label. Without these errors, he's at 81%, which is really quite good. So he inferred where 7 and 8 fit overall, but he didn't yet understand that he understood what they were. I mean, seriously, it could have been 10 and 20. He just knew they were bigger than a 6. But unless he had the successor function, he wouldn't understand where they fit. Okay. So the critical issue, could he infer how to label 7 and 8 objects without being trained? As before, these numbers were never associated with object sets. And he did. The first time we showed him 7 objects, the first time we showed him 8, he was correct. His accuracy decreased a little bit over time. He gets bored with this stuff. But if we showed 6 things and added 1, he said 7. If we showed 8 things and took 1 away. So he understood the unit test. He got this. And he knew what they meant exactly, okay? If we showed a tray with collections of 4, 5, 6, and 9 things of different colors and said, what color 8? He said none. He didn't just go to the largest set he knew, which was 8, and say 8. He looked, there weren't 8 things there, and he said none. So he really understood what was going on. So he demonstrated the successor function in a way similar to children, okay, by doing this mapping. So we could argue for some level of numerical competence, but we died before we could study the larger numbers. And the point that much still remained and remains in terms of gaining the knowledge. Had we decided that he could count when he could just, look at the sets of objects and label them, we would have missed all this other incredible information and thought we understood what numbers were without really understanding what he understood numbers were. So this was one of the tasks that, again, important to get into the weeds. We also started looking at studies of exclusion, partially because we had some data on linguistic mutual exclusivity during label acquisition. So what is that? Okay, when young children are first learning their labels, they think every object has a label, but only one label. So you look at a very young child who knows that this is a doggy and this is a kitty, and then you tell them it's an animal, and they literally will look at you and go, no, doggy, okay? It's like, okay, well, obviously they don't stay stuck in that set because they wouldn't understand category or anything. But because he was trained in a different way, but when we trained our other birds the way children were, they came up with this mutual exclusivity. So the question was, okay, what about a more general form of exclusion, and why is it so important? Because if done properly, it's a strong test of inferential abilities. Okay, and this was work that Premack had started, and there were people before him, but he did the stuff with his apes, and it's a conventional 2-top task, which a lot of people have replicated since. Okay, so you have 2 foods, they're inserted in view of the animal. You make sure that they like both those foods equally well. And then you turn around, you take one food away, you turn back, you show them you're eating that food, and you say, here's a treat, you better know where the other food is, okay? And they need to infer where the remaining food is, knowing that one has disappeared, okay? We also performed visual removals to test if they had side preferences and contract the simpler task, okay? And we used 4 group parrots. And this was exciting because we were able to expand our data set here because this was a vocal task. Pets. Now, admission, they weren't just pets. They belonged to Carl Ann Hartsfield, who had been working in my lab. They understood all of our, they understood the importance of data collection. Carl was also a nuclear naval submarine commander, so they also understood protocols. And the idea is when you have a protocol, you follow it to the letter. They videotaped every single trial that their birds did, not just the ones where their birds were smart, because they understood that we needed all the data. Okay, so this was these amazing birds to work with. Okay, and so we carefully control for odor. We ensured that they were random when you had one was hidden and no manipulation, association. So the idea was it wasn't just track what was, being waved in front of their face and something like that. Okay, local enhancement, we carefully manipulated both cups in their vision at the same amount of time. And we had inter-observer reliability. We either videotaped all the trials or we had a secondary online observer making sure as to what the birds were doing. Okay, and all the birds really got it, okay? They understood whether it was a visible or invisible. They were really good at this task. They understood they had inference by exclusion. Well, we thought they had inference by exclusion. The question though, if you think about it in detail, were they just avoiding the cup from which something was removed? All right. Well, how do you test that? Do they really understand that something is in the other cup? So we repeated this, doing all the study trials all over again, but on some trials, we had 2 treats of differing value under each cup. Now, they like their chow, eat it, but chow quality treats. In fact, by the time we were finishing this study, the birds had their Will Birdie checkup, and my vet literally said to us, "Your bird's on the edge of, parrot diabetes. What are you feeding them?" And I had to say, "Okay, we'll only do this for another week or 2, and then we'll be done." Because you don't want to give them a lot of this stuff. It's not healthy for them, but they love it. Okay. The idea was you would take out either 1 piece of chow or 1 heart. Okay. Idea was they would still go for the 1 heart because it's so much better than 1 piece of chow, and which they did. Okay. So we replicated this with all 4 birds, and Franco had a little bit of trouble going back to the standard, but he did very well on the visible and invisible with the favorite treats, and all the other birds did very well on everything else. So again, they got it. They were not just going to the cup, from which something had been moved. All right. So these experiments are thought to test what's called the disjunctive syllogism. A or B, not A, therefore B, done, okay? And you evaluate. However, if you are, like I was, attending all these seminars on child development and talking to people who really are getting into the weeds with this, is the idea that both A and B are plausible likelihoods. And this is the work of Shilpa Moody and Susan Carey. This is something all previous studies failed to entertain. So the idea is, okay, you have 2 cups and you cover them and you put a treat in one of them. The animal or the child doesn't know where the treat is. It could be an A or B. But what if it's maybe A, maybe B? Think about it this way instead. You show them it's not A. If you're thinking A or B, well, it's therefore B. But if you're saying maybe A, maybe B, it's still only maybe B. You choose B because it's your better option, but it's not that you really know that it's there. You're just still going kind of, oh, maybe. So an attempt to distinguish between these 2 alternatives, Moody and Carey designated 3 and 4 cup tasks, which we gave to Griffin. Okay, so the 3 cup task is to test what they know about certainty. So you have 3 cups, you cover 1, you put a treat in it, you put a treat in one of the other 2, and you ask the subject choose. Now, if they understand what's going on, it's like, yeah, you're going to choose A because it's absolutely positively without a doubt in B. And the other ones, it's maybe C or D, right? Okay. So you would think that there would be no problem on this. Okay. The 4 cup task, you have 2 sets of cups, you cover 1, put a treat in 1, you cover the other, put a treat in the other. You show them it's not A. Again, if you understand what's going on, it's 100% B, right? And there's only a 50-50 chance there. Now, if you want to gamble, you C or D, but most of the time you want that treat, and so you're not going to gamble. And so again, the 3 cup task demonstrates certainty, but if the subject is using a maybe A, maybe B, they will fail on the 4 cup task, choosing amongst all 3 cups randomly. Because again, it's, if it's maybe A or B here instead of or, then it's maybe any of the 3 of them. Okay. So here's a video of Griffin doing the task. We did it.
Empty, 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 empty. Can you move over a little bit? Move over a little bit, yeah. Okay. 2, 3, and show 1. Look, we got nuts.
Nuts? We both have nuts? We both have nuts?
Show 1 right here. Look, empty. Only 1, 2. Okay, good boy. Good.
So the interesting thing, here's Griffin doing really, really well. But you see the 2.5-year-old children, they really don't get it. They're not even that great on the certainty, okay? And even the 3- and 4-year-old children, okay, they're not really all that terrific, okay? So Griffin clearly outperformed even the 5-year-olds. They weren't at ceiling, okay? The 2.5-year-olds could not do the 4-cup test at all, and they show less certainty on the 3-cup task. So the question is, you know, these 2.5-year-old kids are pretty young. Maybe they fail because they lack linguistic knowledge of what's going on. It turns out they have to be about 3 years old before they have functional use of or, okay? That is, respond to things, do you want peas or carrots? They don't want either, but at least you're giving them a choice and they understand there's a choice, okay? So Griffin, he speaks, he understands speech, he has labels that, you know, we have data, good data for about 30 different colors, shapes, and numbers and things like that. He does not have functional or. We've never trained him on or. We never give him a choice, to be honest. Okay, so it's also true, and he still succeeded, but it's also true that exclusion takes a burden on visual working memory. And other data from our lab show that even 8-year-olds are challenged in a visual working memory task involving 4 objects and 4 switches, okay? But Griffin is not. He beats out Harvard undergraduates on some of these tasks. And in a separate study, we showed that he really understands probability at the same level that Piaget showed for 6- and 8-year-old children. So we know it's not the formal language as a prerequisite for this logical construct. And there's another study that just came out by Ferringo on baboons that also shows that if you do replicate the 4-cup study with baboons, they also get it. The baboons, however, Griffin only had like 16 or 32 trials of baboons. Were 68% on 100 trials, so they weren't quite as accurate, but the point was they could get it. So it's, you know, probability and visual working memory might be involved. And you notice that, and the reason I say that too is because there are these pre-points. You would notice it sometimes in the baboons and sometimes Griffin when you look at the videos, and sometimes, okay, as you're removing the object, they're starting to move to the cup next to the empty. Okay, it's again next to the empty because there's a lot of stuff and they want to kind of set themselves to get it. Okay, so the other issue was that each child only had like 3 or 4 trials, but we had only 1 parrot. So Griffin had like, you know, probably about 32 trials or something like that. Maybe it, again, simply learn to go to the cup next to the empty ones, you know, as the baboons. Okay. So we did 2 more experiments to force him to gamble, to not go to the cup next to the empty cup, okay? To see if he would choose one of the cups on the 50% side. So we had to make it worth his while. So we did experiment 3, which had 16 regular trials with the nut, just the same way. And then we had 8 trials in which he saw that nothing was put in on what should be the 100% trial, all right? So here he had to, you know, but if he wasn't avoiding empty, okay, we also wanted to see experiment 4, all right, because, you know, if there was nothing on that side, he would gamble, but he didn't like it, okay. But for experiment 4, we had 16 regular trials with nut that he liked, but 8 trials with a Skittle, again, sweets that he absolutely incredibly adored, rather than another nut. So he could gamble and see if he could have a 50-50 chance to get that Skittle he really, really wanted, or get the nut, which was a sure bet, and he really liked his nuts. So it turns out for the experiment 3, when we replicated experiment 3 work, he went for the sure thing, you know, no question on that. Okay. And he never went to the nut next to the empty. Okay. For the experiment 4, he did go to the cup next to the empty one, but only after failures. Okay. So the problem was, okay, we would give him a trial. he, gambled, he won, he got his Skittle, he was really excited. The next trial he tried for the Skittle, he failed. It's like, uh-oh, I'm not getting anything. So the next gambling trial after that, he went for the sure thing. Okay, and then went for the sure thing, and then, oh, well, maybe I'll try again for the Skittle. But the point was, there's a statistically significantly difference between his gambling on those. Okay, so his data are compelling, but they don't rule out alternative explanations. A simple mental model involving crossing out one location along with a rudimentary understanding of probability would suffice. We need to do other tasks to understand whether he really understands or not a formalism on these things. And we need to understand what kind of cognitive processing are underlying those abilities. And again, you can't stop at what looks like a really cool study if you can think it through and come up with alternative explanations and find out some more exciting abilities and things going on. Without those additional experiments, our claims for, inferential abilities and counting would have been considerably weaker. So take-home messages: be aware of the complexity of the task. Don't overinterpret your data or think that success on a simple task answers a complex question. Accept the possibility of alternative explanations. Design further tests. That's cool. That's not bad. That's not, it's nothing negative. It's cool. It's exciting. And get input from people in other areas. If I had not been religiously sitting in on all the, learning and developmental seminars for the children, I would not be aware of this stuff that they were doing and not have thought to do more work on these projects, okay? And when I was writing up this talk, coincidentally, there was a editorial from the president of APS. And in this, he says, progress is not linear. Progress becomes possible through circling around the same object. Every time we circle the same object, we try out new observation methods, new lenses. We make very different observations as a result, even though the target remains the same. These observations invite new questions, which in turn motivate newer methods. We deepen our understanding. And this circular effort gradually moves science forward. And that's what's so exciting. It's frustrating because you think you got all the answers, but it's so exciting because there's always more to do. And so I want to thank you so very much. And I'm going to stop screen sharing and turn the program over to questions. And for some reason, I'm not hearing everybody, but that's okay. Oh, because everybody's got themselves appropriately muted so that their dogs and cats and things don't.
Yeah.
Okay, questions are all up there. Debbie, why don't you choose who I should talk to?
Okay, so I'm seeing some clapping, but I'm going to look for hand raising. If I'm missing anyone, please start by shouting out, and then I'll
I
go
think
through.
Chris Sturdy, did you have a question?
I was clapping.
Okay, I just saw the hand for a split second. I thought you were trying to get, okay.
I was fixing my hair.
Okay,
I have a question.
go ahead.
Yeah,
Aaron.
I was really interested hearing the depth of the work that you were doing with the numerosity and counting and all the issues that surround that. And I was just reminded of that early work by Elizabeth Brennan and Herb Terrace with the rhesus monkeys, and when they were after learning to press in order pictures of items from 1 to 4 in that order. And so it was an ordinality task, but then they were given novel pairs that extended beyond the training range, and they were very accurate at like 7 versus 9, for example. Is that does that get at that successor function aspect?
It's getting there. It's getting there, but again, because it's you're looking at, she was careful in terms of mass and things like that. But it's still an approximate number system on that, because they're not, they know it's more, but they don't know how much more.
Gotcha. It would take like symbolic labeling.
Yeah, and that's why we trained him on the labels.
Great, thanks.
Sure.
Other questions? I'm also looking in the chat too, so if you have questions, you can put them in the chat.
Yeah, and there's also people who are supposed to be able to ask questions of my, the people who talked in the symposium too. That's,
Yes, yes, exactly.
so it's not just questions for me, it's questions for everybody on the symposium. Hi, everybody, I see all these faces, it's so exciting.
Wonderful to be there. Can you hear me?
Hi, Jan.
Hi,
Jan is my Dutch colleague who
Oh, yeah.
studies parrot, but he's a veterinarian, and we go around the world giving talks to veterinary students on trying to explain to them that they're working with basically pediatric patients, okay, who are as smart as, 3 or 4-year-old children at least, but can't talk to us.
And be a little bit autistic and treat them like autistic children.
Yes.
Make them stories about it. In my daily practice dealing with parrots, some of them I know for 35 years, and my oldest, Gray, was 99 years old. Very few people really realize or know anything about the work of Irene and Alex after more than 40 years, which is still just stunning. And we are happy to travel around to talk to veterinary students at all kind of universities to share this science and my experience over the past almost 40 years dealing with parrots having behavioral problems. And dealing with behavioral problems is dealing with their intelligence. And very few people really understand that concept.
Yeah, so I see there's Anna is asking me my greatest discovery. That's really hard, but I think it's hard to say a greatest discovery, but I think it's sort of in a general sense, the idea that when I started this work, the term avian cognition was an oxymoron. And when I gave my talks in the 80s, people would, literally the hand would come up and say, well, how can they do this? There's no cerebral cortex. And I'm going like, well, you're the neurobiologist, go find it, And of course they did. And you can read all the papers, Nature Reviews Neuroscience, where there's 21 authors on it and stuff. So I think my greatest discovery wasn't exactly a discovery, but as Jan was saying, to basically explain to the world that being called the bird brain should be a compliment, okay? And the idea of getting people to understand that birds are really smart. And we now know, I can, I'll give you a minute or two here, but we now know that neural density in their brains is extraordinarily high. It's at the same level of primates that are much, much larger than they are. The gray parrots in particular have an additional shell for vocal learning, for heterospecific learning. And there's some suggestion that that also triggers some ability in terms of cognitive processing. We know that this area, this cortical-like area, is larger in the birds that tend to do more of this work, corvids and the parrots. Not to say that the other birds don't have these abilities, but you can look at the levels and things. So this area is really terribly important. There was a new paper that came out in terms of showing that certain areas, it just came out by Michael Brainerd, and I read it last week and I can't remember all the details, but there's certain parts of the brain that are similar to the ventral and other parts that are similar to the dorsal areas in mammals. And the areas that are not exactly homologous, they work in an analogous way. So, it's so exciting to have people do all this work. There is a paper that came out a couple of months ago on, if you believe that there's a neural, center for consciousness, okay, which a lot of people don't, but if you do, there's a paper that just came out that basically says, hey, we found one of these in the crow. So, it's just so exciting for people to understand how important this area of research is, that you've got these animals separated from 300 and something million years of evolution. And they're doing the same kind of stuff that 6 to 8-year-old kids can do. That's pretty, and the same thing that chimpanzees can do and dolphins can do. So it's pretty exciting.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
You have a question from Amy. She wants to know, can you share your focus going forward?
Okay, so, you know, I'm sort of feeling, you know, towards the end of the career here. But there's so many things we still want to do. I mean, one of the things we're really excited about is this idea of logic. We started a study that's now on hold because of COVID, but the idea of A or B versus A not B, and training to see if he could understand those. And it turns out to be, again, one of these really complicated things, because you can't just ask him, you know, choose A or B, because then, you know, or A not B, because then he understands, well, the thing that after the not is no good, but you have to go not A, B, or something like that. You have to play around with it in all sorts of complicated ways to make sure you're covering all the you know, bases and stuff. So we're trying to do that. We're trying to do a study on tones. There was a study early on by Stu Hulse showing that starlings couldn't change octaves. And the idea is that for birds like starlings, the octave in which they are calling is important. High notes are affiliative, low notes are aggressive. Grays, okay, my grays, not all necessarily all grays, but my grays, they have to understand males with lower voices and females with higher voices. So they have to be able to shift octaves. So the question is, could they shift the octaves? And again, that's a task that we started working on that was just, you know, held up because of COVID. We are continuing on a delayed gratification study. So it turns out that I'll give you a punchline of a paper that we are just starting to write. So, you know, people can tear it apart during review. But the idea is, if you take away the hot element of using, you know, nuts themselves, but using tokens for nuts, you can get Griffin to wait for up to 15 minutes for more. And all the studies on birds so far, including our original study, show they'll wait for 15 minutes for better, but they'll only wait for, you know, maybe a minute for more. And now by you taking away the hot excitement, he'll wait for this. So again, it's like working this with money, with people. All right. I mean, money itself is only for what it represents. All right. And there are studies with people that we're using this as a parallel. So we'll see. We'll see where all that goes.
Will I ask a question?
Yes. Hi, Andy. Good to see you.
Hi, Irene. It's great to see all this put together in one talk. Super. I guess my question comes from, well, I'm an ethologist, I think, at heart, and perhaps a cognitive ethologist. So I'd just like to ask, you know, how do you see all this relating to Alex's and Griffin's relatives in the wild, living out there? Do you think all of these things you're discovering are kind of operating in them? And to what advantage? I mean, why would a wild parrot need to be interested to distinguish 5 things from 6 things, for example?
Well, you know, in some ways, yes. Think about the fact that they've got a bunch of little, you know, chicks in the nest. They've got to keep count of how many little chicks there are. They've got to remember which one they fed and which one they didn't feed, or, you know, somebody's probably going to die from lack of food. So they need to know that. There's also the possibility, although my student who was studying vocalizations in the wild didn't have a chance to test it, but it's true for certain other birds that the numbers of repetitions of certain syllables or calls are meaningful. So the idea is, if you repeat something twice, it means, well, yeah, but if you repeat it 5 times, it means, yeah, you know, so things like that. So there's things of that nature. They may not need to know exact number systems in the wild, okay? Because if you look at the Priya tribes, okay, the hunter-gatherers, you know, they don't have an exact number system, but I'm sure you took one of their kids and put them in Head Start and they do perfectly fine. So the idea is there's some underlying cognitive architecture there. The inference by exclusion, again, you know, in terms of the daily grind, you kind of have to figure out, you know, well, how are things going? And maybe somebody went away and who's left, and, you know, you have to make these inferences. So exclusion is, it's not so much that the task itself is the important one, but the idea that it's an inferential ability, that you can infer what's happening by processing other bits of data.
Yeah. Great.
Can I interfere? Research in birds like major tits, that they count the eggs related to the statistic outcome of the number of eggs correlated to the survival rate of the baby. So they will never breed on 5 eggs because it doesn't make sense. There need to be at least 7 or 8. And if you take them away, they start over breeding again until they have the right number of eggs correlated to the statistics of the survival rate of the baby. So counting, there is something really worthwhile for birds.
Yeah. Okay.
So you have another question in the chat from Kristen. And the question is, are you doing anything with or and logical equivalence, given that A and B is equivalent to A or B?
Yeah, we will, we'll be looking at that as part of the system, but for right now, we're just doing A or A not. Okay, we did some work with Alex that suggested that he did understand the and concepts. So we're not so, we don't feel that we have to replicate that for Griffin right away.
Great. If I can just follow up. Thanks so much, Irene. I was wondering if using that knowledge of and not that they already have, if you can use that to get at or, given the logical equivalence between the two.
Well, possibly. I mean, the way we're training them is literally with, getting them to identify A and getting them to identify B and getting them to identify F. Okay. And the reason for that is because C sounds too much like B. So we use a sound that is totally different. And so the idea is for having them to look at things on the tray and ask them to, pick A or B or A or F. And then, pick A, your choice is A, not B. Versus, not A, B. And that would be an interesting thing to give them 3 things on the tray and say, not A, B, and see if they pick F and see if they're doing that kind of, and as an implicit. So that's where the and would come in on there. But that's for the future when we can train them again. COVID has made things really difficult.
Thanks so much.
Made a comment. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Marissa made a comment about that she reran old octave studies in starlings and humans also failed at that study. So she's interested in chatting with you about that later.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
Yes.
because we've done some perceptual studies with humans and songbirds and also budgies, like little parrots, right?
Yeah. Cool.
So far, they haven't done it even when the humans can. So it would be interesting to talk about methods.
Yeah, so it's impepper@media.mit.edu.
Okay.
Cool. Oh, do animals learn to learn? Yes. Okay. And, definitely Alex, because he really loves solving problems. And he would, like you saw with the nun thing, he would jump ahead of us. And he did that in several different instances. Griffin is more like the student who tell me what I have to do to get the A and I'll do it. Okay. Because Alex used to really, terrorize him. So when we were working with him, he's got Griffin, what color? And Alex would sit there and go, no, tell me what shape. And Griffin would shrug his little birdie shoulders, look at me, look at Alex and go, oh, what should I answer? I don't know what I should answer. Okay. Or Griffin would, Griffin would say something like green. And Alex would say green, and Griffin would go like that. So, so Griffin's like, okay, just tell me what I have to do, and I'll do it, and I'll get my A, and I'll get my nut, and I'll be all happy, and everything will be good. He's not really that interested in jumping ahead of us, but he obviously, clues into what's happening. So we, like for the exclusion studies, we only modeled a few trials for him, so he understood the game, and he got it, right away. And Athena, who has the, she's getting a little bit better, but initially she had the patience of a flea. Getting her to just sit and attend to anything was so hard. And she's getting better watching, Griffin do his work and things like that. So hopefully it's going to be, she is getting better. I started to do a couple of exclusion trials with her, and she doesn't like it, but she'll do them. So
Okay, there's a question in the chat for Carl. Were the female budgies in the study trained at any point on the puzzle boxes they watched the males opening? Might knowing how to open the boxes make the smarter males more or less attractive? Carl, that's for you.
Yes, thanks. I already answered in the chat actually, but never mind. Good to see you, by the way, and congratulations to Irene on this occasion.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting question, but the females were not trained on the boxes. So they had seen them, they had been in their cage, but they didn't have the opportunity of opening them. They were glued for them. So therefore they had something to gain if they were watching the males, so that they would know how to do that. So that may actually be important. So if they already knew it themselves, maybe they were less interested in males showing the ability to open them. So I think the contrast, that's a good question. The contrast might be important in whether it makes a particular potential mate more attractive or not.
Thank you, Carl. Alex, you're next.
Me? Can I ask a question? Yeah.
Yes, Alex.
Irene, yeah. Congratulations, Irene, again. Lovely to see you.
Yes, this is so exciting, seeing all these faces. Yes.
Yeah, it's like really being together. I was just thinking about what you think of combining your logical and verbal kinds of problems with more motor ones related to tool use and that kind of thing. And one experiment that occurs to me, I just wonder what you would think of. Is suppose that you teach Griffin or any other grade the label for tools or potential tool objects outside any functionality. You turn, for example, you teach them to identify a hook and straight stick, and just to think two things that come to mind. And then, but they don't use them. They only learn to label things of that shape. And then you give them a mechanical problem where one of them is necessary and they have to ask you for that. So can they retrieve the memory for what is a hook and what is a stick without having practiced the functionality?
Ooh, that would be cool.
That would be really nice, really, because it would mean that they can mentally retrieve the representation of the tool and construct the functionality without actually having experienced it.
Right.
I mean, the issue for our guys, I mean, this may be full of holes, but I just was thinking that.
Well, no, I mean, it's exciting. The problem with parrots is they're overall not so much tool users. I mean, well, you know, it would be fun to work with Elise on that with her cockatoos, because they like to do tool use, and they can learn some vocalizations. Because our guys, you know, they have the Gordian knot approach to these things. Well, we'll just tear the darn thing apart, you know, with their beaks, instead of using a tool. But it would be kind of fun to get our guys to, you know, try to work with Elise on this, because her cockatoos, you know, would love to do that, I'm sure. And they already choose tools. Yeah, they already choose, you know, she already has some beautiful stuff where they choose appropriate tools, and, you know, for a particular task, lovely things. There's a ball and a stick study where you give them a choice and they'll choose the ball when they need the ball and the stick where they need the stick and things like that.
Okay, thank you. I think we should probably move on because we're 17 minutes after. So there's still a few questions. Maybe you can ask Irene in the breakout sessions. That would be great. So I'm going to move over to Suzanne Gray, who's going to start with the social events. Suzanne, are you ready for that?
Cool.
To get the screen right.